With voices from all sides of the political spectrum, let's get to our panel. Here with us in D.C., Eleanor Clift is a political analyst for The Daily Beast. In Phoenix, Chris Buskirk is a conservative radio host and publisher and editor of the website American Greatness. Also on set, Gordon Gray is director of fiscal policy at the conservative think tank, the American Action Forum. And Hillary Shelton is the director of the NAACP's Washington, D.C. Bureau. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Eleanor, let me start with you. 18 months since President Trump took office, and you know, politicians often ask that question, are you better off now or before the election? Broadly speaking, what does the balance sheet look like for President Trump?
Well, the economy is going gangbusters, and he has delivered on a number of his promises, a crackdown on immigration, the reducing of a lot of regulations that were protecting air and water and various aspects of the climate, denial of climate change. So he has delivered for his base in a lot of areas. Where he hasn't delivered is much meaningful legislation out of the Congress, and wages have not gone up. And with this latest wave of tariffs and counter tariffs that are being imposed, people who are likely to be hurt the most are people who voted for President Trump in the heartland, because it's their industries that are hurting and it's their jobs that are suffering.
Right, you say he's done well for his base. What about the rest of the country?
Oh, I think the level of acrimony in this country and the divisions are extraordinary, and you hear various analysts say the country hasn't been so divided since Reconstruction. That goes back a long way. In my lifetime, I would say it hasn't been as divided as we see today since 1968, when we had the population against the war and you had assassinations going on. So I think the future of the Supreme Court has now been put in the mix, and the ability of Donald Trump to sort of impose his brand on Congress, on the Republican Party, on the Supreme Court, has made people really question whether our democracy is threatened.
All right, let me bring in Chris. Chris, you're a supporter of President Trump, and he has been a controversial president, to say the least. Opinions are very divided, as we've just heard, depending on whom you're talking to. But how did President Trump earn your loyalty?
Yeah, I mean, look, opinions, of course, are divided. That's why we have politics, right? I mean, Barack Obama was viewed differently by left and right as well. You know, one of the things that President Trump did, maybe the thing that President Trump did, that won my loyalty, and I was an early adopter. I'm never an early adopter with technology, but with the president I was. I heard him talking about America and American citizenship in a way that I had not heard for 30 years. And talking about the responsibility that government has to its citizens to protect the interest of American citizens, to protect the interest of this country, whether it be in trade or in immigration. And that was where I said, well, this is a light bulb moment for me. This is a president who's going to change the status quo in the Republican Party for sure, but hopefully in the country, and try and restore the small r republicanism that is what is the foundation of our liberty and of this republic itself.
Hillary, President Trump has said that he will look after the interests of this country. He will look after the interests of the citizens of this country. Those were his campaign promises. Has it come at something of a cost?
I think it has. As a matter of fact, I think about the communities that the NAACP serves, and certainly the issues and concerns in the African-American community and other racial and ethnic minority communities. We're seeing that it has been troublesome as we've seen this administration come in and actually undercut some of the progresses that were made by the previous administration. Whether we're thinking about issues like health care coverage, and we went from 47 million Americans having no health care insurance at all, to increasing that to adding 27 million Americans to the health care rolls. When we saw the previous administration, prior to the Obama administration, actually veto a bill that would add 4 million children to the health care rolls, and we're seeing an administration now that actually wants to go back to those days in which 47 million had no health care. As we talk about repealing Obamacare, as some people call it, or the Affordable Care Act, What we're not seeing is him coming forward with anything that would actually provide health care for the American people.
Yeah.
So in essence, between those issues and the signals that are being sent to police officers that they don't have to worry about being concerned of shooting unarmed African Americans, because we've seen yet another shooting of an unarmed African American in our society, shot in the back, as a matter of fact, as we watch a 17-year-old lose his life. As we look at issues to provide protection from predatory lenders. We know 2008, as we looked at the economic downturn in our country, much of that was because we didn't have the regulatory protections of the American consumer. We created something called the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. But what we've seen now in this administration is a move to repeal those protections that have proven to be successful. So in essence, there are a number of things that he's rolling back on and things that he's not doing, recognizing the unique nature of the very diverse communities throughout our country.
Okay, I want to give Chris a chance to very quickly respond to what you've just heard, Chris.
Yeah, I would. I'll tell you, I want to pick up on one thing where I think we may actually have a point of agreement, and that is if you look back at that sort of run up to the Great Recession, 2008. You know, one of the things that happened is that there was a socializing of losses while profits were all private. In other words, these huge banks got enormous, but they knew that they could offload all their losses onto the public. But of course, this was a policy that was shared by both George W. Bush and by Barack Obama. It's wholly inappropriate, the best thing that we can do if we want to try and have any sort of consumer protection is to make sure that we have financial institutions that are answerable for their actions. But on a bigger scale, one of the things that I think we need to focus on is that President Trump is talking about doing things that get people back to work. That's why we see the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years. That is a necessary precursor to wages starting to rise, drawing people back into the labor force. And that's one of the things that I think is going to be key as we focus on the run-up to the midterms is who's working? How much are they making? Are people able to go back and live their lives and raise their families in a way that seems suitable to them?
Okay. Gordon, you are a conservative, but you are not a Trump supporter. What do you make of the president's performance these past 18 months? And something that we've heard very often over the last 18 months is that the president is going to put America first.
Well, I would say that certainly viewed from the narrowest possible lens with respect to economic policy, any objective look at the economy right now would have to be a favorable one. Quite a bit of that was already on trend before the president took office. I think that there is some salutary effect from the tax policies and from the deregulatory approach. However, I am very concerned about the trade policies and immigration policies that could very well reverse any potential gains from the policies that I mentioned before, and our long-term economic challenge, which is threatened by, I think, unsustainable budget challenges and structural issues in the labor force that this president's policies are actually going to be a counterweight on. So I would say through the narrowest possible lens, okay, but in the broader issues, I'm not impressed.
You talk about trade issues, immigration issues, Gordon. What's gone wrong there? What specifically are you opposed to?
I'm opposed to tariffs as a means of trade policy. I think the consensus of the economic literature among all economists minus Peter Navarro is that tariffs are bad policy, that trade war can't be won, that there's nothing but losers. So I know the previous guest made mention to the light bulb moment. Well, I hope that light bulb isn't imported, because we'll be paying more for it. And on immigration, it's been an unmitigated disaster.
Yes.
I nothing left to add to that.
Well, the pictures tell the story, don't they, on immigration? Eleanor, if we look at the political climate in the United States right now, and you've talked about this, you've talked about the deep divisions in the country, do you see any common ground here? Because, you know, we often hear that the Democrats who are in the opposition, they've mounted what's been termed the resistance here. But do you see common ground?
Yeah, I've always been a big believer in common ground and in elections as circuit breakers where you get to have a fresh start. But frankly, right now, I don't see any. I think the Democrats are powerless. They don't have either House of Congress. They don't have the White House. And I think it's clear they don't have the U.S. Supreme Court. And that's going to get worse because the president is going to have yet another nomination. So I think the Democrats, in order to keep some momentum among their followers, among the resistance, they've got to fight. I don't see any compromises in the offing. And I think, immigration is one area where there should be some common ground, but the Republicans can't agree among themselves. And when you have 3.9% unemployment, you can't argue that these people are coming to take our jobs. So the president has really scapegoated immigrants in a really ugly way, and I think that's going to be a stain on this country and for a long time to come.
Chris, what are your thoughts on that? The country is very polarized right now. Do you see any areas where the two sides can get together, move things forward? I mean, all we have to do is look at Congress to see what the logjam looks like.
Yeah, I mean, this may seem counterintuitive, but you would think that the one place where we could find some common ground would be on stemming the flow of illegal immigration, right? We have immigration laws on the books for a reason, which is to protect the rights and interests not only of the country writ large, but also of individual American citizens. And it should be an unremarkable event that a president wants to enforce immigration law, and yet we have Democrats and Republicans who think that this is something unusual or that it should be made to seem completely outlandish, and it shouldn't. This is one of the things that resonates most strongly with the Republican base, but also with a segment of the Democrat base, which is to say that when you are importing millions of unskilled laborers, that undermines the economic safety and the economic security of the most vulnerable citizens of this country, and it is the president's job to try and protect the interests of those people, of American citizens, and that's what he's doing.
Can I just respond to
Go ahead.
that? No one is saying that we shouldn't enforce immigration law, but the displays that the president put on of really almost theatrical cruelty, of saying we're going to separate families, that is not necessary. And
Eleanor, that's mandated by congressional law.
Well, actually,
and the president has said, go ahead and change
one
the
moment,
law.
Chris. I'll get to you. Go ahead, Eleanor.
Well, it's not mandated by congressional law. You can't detain families with children over 20 days, which is why their ankle bracelets were used and people were given court dates into the future. And we are a country of rule of laws, which conservatives love to say all the time. And this is a president who said we don't need due process at the border. We should just turn these people back, completely ignoring the rights that our Constitution gives everybody, not only American citizens. And so I think that's where you have the disagreement.
What are your thoughts on that, Hillary?
No, I strongly agree. As a matter of fact, the same laws that this administration is enforcing are the laws that were enforced by the previous administration in very different ways. And quite frankly, what we're talking about is enforcing a law that everybody on both sides seem to agree is both broken and fractured. So in essence, we have to reassess those laws so we're not enforcing the wrong laws, and in this case, in the wrong way. So I strongly agree with you. And let me also add just one more point. That point is that the harshness in which we're seeing this immigration laws enforced seems to be very race-based in many ways as well.
Right.
I've not seen the same thing happening at the Canadian border that we're seeing happening at the Mexican border. Yet Canadians come across the border all the time to work in our country and do other things as well. So what we're seeing is a program that's being administered in a manner that is very racially discriminatory, I would argue, on so many different levels.
You know, Hillary, notwithstanding how these laws are being implemented, and I don't mean to make light of this. We've seen those pictures. They're very cruel pictures that we have seen. Didn't President Trump inherit many of these problems, like the immigration issue in this country? It needs to be fixed. I mean, that's been something that's been talked about for a long time.
I strongly agree with you. We've been pushing to try to fix those things. There have been a number of comprehensive bills that we've tried to move forward, even bills that were supported by both Democrats and Republicans. I remember working on a bill to try to address this immigration problem when Ted Kennedy was still alive and actively involved in the Senate, along with Orrin Hatch. So in many cases, we're saying that we do have to, and they did actually inherit many of these problems. But what's fascinating for me is, in inheriting these problems, they still handled them in a very different way than the previous administration, and quite frankly, in a way that I think many, many Americans see as being just outrageous, particularly against
when President Obama was in the White House, the Senate passed, the Republican Senate passed a compromise immigration bill with 68 votes.
Yes.
And the Republican-led House never would bring it up. And in part because the Republicans have this idea that the Speaker of the House only should pass legislation that Republicans agree with the majority. They just discount Democratic votes. If they came up with a bill that could get Democratic support and lose some Republican support, they could pass something. They don't want to do it.
I firmly agree.
I would also just add is I just don't have a lot of sympathy in general for the argument about presidents inheriting problems. And therefore their hands are tied. Presidents run for that office.
Right.
And then they become president of the United States. And they run for that office presumably to solve problems. And so if you want that office, you ought to go into it with open eyes. And so I just don't really have any sympathy for this administration's claims of we inherited this problem, or the last administration's claims that frequently blamed every ill under the sun on George Bush. I just don't have much sympathy for that argument.
Okay, Chris, your turn. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I will agree with that. I mean, there is, when you say we inherited these problems, that may be true as a matter of historical fact, but that's right. I mean, the presidents and any elected leader has to say, yeah, maybe I inherited this, but I'm here to fix it, and here's what I plan to do about it. And that's right. Now, the issue, of course, that we have is that when it comes, for instance, to immigration, President Trump has laid out his 4 pillars, but the House leadership, the Republican leadership, doesn't agree with that. The majority of the Republican caucus does. The majority of the Republican base does. I think the majority of the country does. But you know, there is an open borders monopoly on elite opinion, and that has been probably the biggest single stumbling block to doing something sensible at the border. And that is, you know, that's a shame, because I think that does the American people a disservice. And when the president talks about protecting the rights of all American citizens, I think that's what he's doing.
Okay. Eleanor, there is something else at play here, and this is perhaps unique to the United States because of its place in the world, because of the extent of its soft power, if I could put it that way. In the past 18 months, that is, has the international image of the United States been tarnished?
First of all, I don't know anybody who's espousing an open borders policy, just as a footnote to what the guest just said.
Right.
I think the view around the world, our allies are questioning whether we're really behind them anymore. The president has gone out of his way to diss Canada and Germany in particular, and now is scheduling a summit meeting with the Russian president soon after the allies meet in Europe. It is being interpreted by our allies as a direct slap at them and an opening of arms, physical arms, not military arms, to Mr. Putin, while there is an investigation into this administration and the Trump campaign's possible collusion with Russia to help affect the election. So you've got the president doing very well in Mr. Putin's eyes, in the North Korean leader's eyes, and I'm glad that war is averted, but I'm not sure that he got any different deal than previous presidents have gotten. And so it depends which part of the world you're looking at. Our traditional allies are the most nervous about this president's intentions and where they stand in his eyes.
Right, Gordon, what are your thoughts on that? Because we also heard this during the George W. Bush administration, that America's image had been hurt because of the war and what happened there.
Well, I think we're in just a different era. I think I mean, when you look at the fights that this president has essentially picked are primarily with our allies. And I think it's important just to focus on just that concept is these are other countries with their own interests, and they are our allies because we share interests. And if this administration continues to pursue policies that are antithetical to the interests of those who have been our allies, then they may look elsewhere, and they may find you know, that their interests are satisfied through other arrangements. And that's a diminution of I think, American influence and interests abroad. And I think that that's very dangerous. And I think that this administration has not approached our allies, certainly in a dangerous world, deliberately or prudently.
Right, because Hillary, one of the criticisms we hear very often that, let's say the president's meeting with Kim Jong-un, or the prospective meeting with Vladimir Putin, big on ceremony. They're photo ops, little of substance.
I totally agree. But what we see too often is the showmanship, but not the real policy. As we talk about whether we're talking about pillars and moving from pillars to policy, or whether we're talking about having meetings along these lines and actually crafting a program or a strategic engagement between countries, we're not seeing it. And in essence, we're actually losing something in the process. It was an amazing thing for me to watch Harley-Davidson, which is a symbol of American enterprise in so many ways. Actually, we've got to shut down things in the United States so we can move to Europe because of a policy that was set forward by an American president. That makes no sense whatsoever on so many different levels. So the bottom line is this, I think, this, as you're saying, and is we have to make sure that the policies that we need are responding to the real needs of the American people, and that the programmatic approach coming from our president, meeting with international leaders, are setting policy as he does so often from his desk with executive orders and executive guidances, are again consistent with what is in the best interest of all the American people, with no difference of race, gender, ethnicity, or other orientation differences.
Chris, has this president changed this country's priorities? Has this America First policy, this America First doctrine, if you could call it that, hurt the relationship with traditional allies?
With some of the traditional allies, perhaps it has, and I guess I just define what those allies are, just so we're clear. I mean, we talk about Great Britain, we talk about France, we talk about Germany. Those are probably the three that come to mind where people are thinking, you know, and maybe you add Canada in there. Those are maybe the 3 or 4 traditional allies you think that where we have some differences of opinion right now. On the other hand, we see the president engaging in a very energetic foreign policy with other allies, with other friends around the country. He has a very good relationship with Japan and the Prime Minister there, with the Prime Minister of India. We see, of course, what's going on the Korean Peninsula. He's got a good relationship with what Don Rumsfeld once called New Europe, the governments of Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, etc. And this maybe is just something that the opinion makers need to get used to, which is that this is not all about the Atlantic Alliance anymore. The United States has broader interests, and we need to seek out our friends who share those interests. And it doesn't appear that people like Angela Merkel do.
Right. There are people who also say that the United States has now become a fully fledged isolationist power.
Yeah, well, this is an odd type of isolationism if you see a president who is so deeply engaged in other parts of the world. Isolationism seems to be defined as doing something different than what France and Germany want to do.
Well, pulling out of the climate deal, pulling out of the Iran treaty, which contained their nuclear ambitions, pulling out of the Pacific Trade Partnership. Right. These are all discounting the traditional allies and also new alliances that we were building up. And, you know, I'm very conscious of the fact that, that China is a rising world power, and that everything that President Trump has done has actually benefited their ability to expand their power and their ambitions. Now, maybe that's a good thing, but the president has basically conceded a lot of American power on the world stage.
There is something else we've heard, Gordon, and this was from the Secretary General of NATO. He was talking in June, and he said, President Trump is inexperienced, and because of that inexperience, the world is now a more dangerous place.
I don't take issue with that statement. I have decried, I think, if not the death, but certainly the illness to expertise and experience. I understand sort of in wave elections that change is always a very salient political message, but I also look for competence, and I haven't seen a lot of it.
Hillary?
I would agree. I would say that he's differently experienced, and certainly that background of mega business and issues along those lines and whatnot play very well in that community. But when thinking about working within the context of a democracy, we have someone that's clearly flawed in that ability. Being able to sit down with those on either side of the table, whether you agree or disagree with them, to try to hammer out great policy that actually helps advance the American people, as we talk about America first. For some reason, we're not seeing that either.
Yet, people will point to the fact that when it comes to the economy, and you know that pictures that often presented to us of people sitting around the kitchen table, he can point to success there, couldn't he?
In some cases he can, in some cases not. I think what we're going to see and what we've begun to see is that people are losing jobs as a result of the policy initiatives that he's moved forward.
Yeah.
Some of the people, what we may see is those who sat on the left side of the table may be making less money than those who sat on the right side of the table now, but he seems to just be swapping it out with no some improvement. And that raises major concerns for us all as well.
And that's where we are going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at CGTN America, or visit us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.